Well, it's time to start the reassembly process for the camera body now. So typically I start assembling the front standard to the bellows cover, and when that's all assembled, then I can move on to other things. So what we're interested in here is the trigger finger, if you like, for the shutter release, which fits on here. All these components have been cleaned, all the minor mechanical components have been degreased and then through the ultrasonic cleaner to remove any contaminants. Fitting the return spring here, and check that the 3 screws are screwed down snug. The action's nice and snappy. Typically I pop a little bit of graphite powder in there, work the action once or twice, and remove any excess graphite powder. You may wonder why I'm so keen on using graphite powder instead of a touch of grease or something of that nature. It's anything grease is great for attracting dust, dirt, things of that nature, grit, sand, and trapping it and holding it. And whereas something dry like a graphite powder or a molybdenum powder, if you had that instead I suppose, will not do that. Molybdenum in particular, both graphite and molybdenum, provide like a tiny thin film that is nice and slippery. So we have that. Then we have the top and bottom buttons for releasing the front. And these need to fit into here before we slide the sections together. And here I do use a touch of grease. The springs in this case, the springs fit down into the little hole in these buttons. They do not go over the post, they go down in the hole. The buttons are identical, top and bottom. Holding those buttons in with finger and thumb, and slide the front standard through the mount, and the button should clip back into place. Need a bit of lubricant. Now there are 2 guide rails, one top and one bottom. They should have a little bit of grease on them. That's what the two sections slide together on. It's also worth putting a wipe in to the inside surfaces of the black shroud where that button, the spring-loaded button, is going to run. That makes that much smoother. So that section's together. We have this component. This is part of the shutter release. It fits in. The shutter release shaft travels down through this piece and presses on it. This piece in turn presses on this finger, and that finger presses on the shutter. So I need to feed this into position. It sits in at the top. Now sliding these two sections together effectively traps this piece in here. It can't fall out. If I was to slide that section forward, this piece would be floating. Almost inevitably it will fall out at an inconvenient moment when I'm trying to fit it into the body, and I would have to disassemble everything to put things back where they should be. So I'll pop that aside for one moment. That bit is done. Here we have the transfer shaft that transfers the action from the shutter cocking rack through to the shutter at the front of the camera. I normally put some grease on that, on the gear at the back, on all faces of the gear, front and back, and it certainly doesn't hurt to have it on the teeth. This is the bracket that holds it in position. And drop that into the body, holding that in with my finger from underneath. I can fit its retaining screw. I get that screw started. Don't bother about running it up tight yet, that's not helpful. Now I need to set the position of that bracket. The hole is slightly oversized that the screw runs through, so we can adjust its position slightly forward or backwards. If it sticks too far forward, our potential problem there is that the transfer shaft can float too far forward, in which case the rack, the toothed rack here, will not be contacting full width, and then the gear will wear out very quickly. So normally I use feeler gauges, and I use a 4/1000th of an inch, which this tells me is 0.102 millimeters. I found that to be a good allowance to make for movement here. So I put the rack in place over the gear, slide my feeler gauge in behind it, and if I take a decent sized screwdriver, I've picked every one out of the box but the one I want, I slide that screw as far back as it will go and do the screw up. At that stage the rack should run smoothly in that groove. I'm just checking that the bracket's nice and square. It appears to be. I'll check that I've got the correct spacing there. I think that's a bit more clearance than I normally want there. I'll just shift that. That feels a bit snugger. I'm just checking the action of this, see if it moves smoothly. There's some reluctance there. And I am looking at the moment at the state of my shutter cocking rack. It's definitely too tight. Let's get that rack out. Oh, very interesting. Alright. The shutter cocking rack is actually damaged. I hadn't picked that when we were playing with the camera earlier, but now looking at it after this component's been through the cleaner, I can see that the section here has got very damaged. The teeth are damaged right at the end of the stroke. That means that it very likely would not have cocked the shutter correctly had the shutter not actually been cocked. So that is probably damage that occurred later after the camera had been drowned, and probably in the normal testing procedure that people would apply trying to make their camera work afterwards. I'm not 100% sure of that, but I think that's probably the answer. So a new cocking rack is required. I better get one. Right, try again with a new cocking rack. I'll just check that the clearance is good. Seems slightly tight. Perhaps this cocking rack is slightly thicker. It certainly rolls nice and smoothly over that gear, as the other one did not. That's interesting. Wasn't watching for that one, that problem to show up. That's good. I don't want that bracket to move, so normally I'll put a tiny drop of lacquer on the inside where that bracket's held to keep it from shifting. And our front standard and bellows shroud can be dropped into position. Like that. There are 4 screws. 2 of them are quite obvious for the base because they'll have traces of glue and typically some light corrosion on them. And I'm doing those up very lightly. So as not to disturb the pressed in inserts in that black shroud. Any downward pressure will pop those inserts out, and then you've got the tedious business of removing this to put the inserts back in place. That's fine, they're all in place. I can tighten those 4 screws up. This is an opportune time to put the tripod socket back on the bottom of the camera, otherwise every time you press it down on the bench you're pressing the back catch release and the back pops open and annoys you. So we want the tripod socket. This little alloy piece here drops in first. Your film cassette sits in that little recess. Very occasionally you might find this piece damaged if somebody has gone out of their way to try and fit a quart into a pint pot and screw in a much longer tripod screw and really wants to fit in there. I can't say I strike it very often, but I did note it with a camera recently that somebody done exactly that. Some camera tripods would have quite a long screw for attaching them to the camera. Typically they had a threaded collar which you used to limit the amount of thread that would travel into the camera. And sometimes people didn't understand what it was for, or they lost it and they would just run the screw in until they could physically fit no more in and damage the socket. That's good. Just checking that this front section slides in and out smoothly. You'll notice I'm not pulling it all the way until it clicks into position, and that's because we are in danger of losing that piece there if it's got nothing to support it. Here's our shutter release shaft, and I'm just going to lubricate that lightly with molybdenum. Put that in position. Now that piece can't fall out easily, and I can slide this section right out, click it into place, check the action of the shutter release, check everything else. That's good. Now I've got to be careful not to open the front of this camera, slide that forward with this piece missing, otherwise we'll lose stuff. Our focus assembly, I'll start with the mount, the main component. That's held into the front standard with 4 nickel plated screws. I'll pull this lot forward so we can see it. Remind me not to lose that shutter release while we're doing it. Otherwise I'll be demonstrating how to strip a camera down again very quickly and recover. Get the 4 screws started. Once they're all in place, go around, snug them down. Our focus helical, the inner and outer section, will be screwed together. It's a multi-start thread. I'm looking at the alignment of the inner and outer components. You'll recall that I scribed lines across them so I could put it back together in the correct orientation. And I'm looking now to make sure I have this thing aligned correctly. And I can see my double scribe on the inner section here and my double scribe on the outer section at this point, they should come together when these surfaces are even, where they're level. So I need to start that a bit further in. Now that's tight, that's running tight on the thread. That's not uncommon when it's got no lubricant at all. I'll just put a bit of solvent on there, that's naphtha. I'm just working this. There'll be just some fragment of metal, some dried bit that was in there causing that to happen. Now I need to move this up perhaps one position, restart it and check to see where my alignment marks come to. No, I'm still out. I haven't, I think there's about 16 positions you can start the thread. That looks very, very good. So there it is. I've got my alignment marks across there and there. That's my double mark. That was my single mark through there. Somebody else's single mark through there. So they'd marked it in the same way. I'm just checking the action of the inner and outer. Make sure that's nice and smooth. There's nothing there that bothers me. Making sure there are no hard deposits left on this after the cleaning. It would be causing it to be rough in its action, but it all looks good. So I'll lubricate the helical. I'm rolling the inner helical out most of the way, and let's put a little smear of grease in about 5 positions around the helical. You don't need to clog the thread with grease, that's counterproductive. It'll just make it very stiff. I'm working that backwards and forwards, which will spread the grease of course. And I'm also checking the feel of it, see if it feels nice and smooth. I'm quite happy with that. I'll apply some grease to the outside surface where it's going to sit inside the body here and on that face. You'll see there are 2 guideposts in here that stop the inner helical from rotating. So I'm just lubricating the slot in which those guideposts run. Checking the alignment of my helical, remembering that I had the double scribe mark at the bottom, the single scribe mark at the top, and I'm just making sure that I've put it back like that. Just running this with my tweezers to make sure that the action is smooth. It looks good. Here's our retainer, the front retainer ring for it. So I put some grease around there. Now you'll see bright marks on the edge, typically in 4 places. That's where it has been in contact with the helical previously. Those are the friction spots, and that's where it needs to have the lubricant. 4 screws, countersunk screws, flathead screws depending on where you are. Here are the short ones, and I'll run those in. As usual, run the screws in, don't tighten them up immediately. Check the action, check that it's all good and smooth, that nothing's binding. Nip those 4 screws up. Check the action again, yes, it's still smooth. Now I'm going to close the front down. I might have to pull over the shaft for the transfer shaft. It doesn't always drop back through the hole neatly by itself. We have 4 black screws which drop through those 4 positions in the front of that retainer ring, and these screws go right through the front standard and fix to the front of the bellows at behind the front standard. So I'll get those screws started. They usually start very easily. The only time you have trouble with aligning those is if you've replaced the bellows, but that's a very uncommon thing to have to do, and unless you've put it in 90 degrees out, you'll usually find the holes fairly easily anyway. Right, well that's working smoothly. I can put my focus scale ring in place. Again, we have our alignment marks that we'd scribed through there. They're fairly obvious. So I can drop the 4 screws into place. At this stage you have 4 screws that'll hold this focus scale ring to the helical. There are 2 similarly looking but slightly smaller screws which hold the front ring on this assembly. So when you get down to this, there'll be 6 screws that look vaguely similar. Find the 4 largest, they're the ones you want to do this job. And the 2 smaller remainders we'll be using in about 2 minutes. I'll get these screws run down. Before I tighten them, I will check the alignment of my focus scale ring, that the scratch marks we put in there line up correctly, top and bottom. I'm happy with that. I'll just snug those screws up. They only need to be snugged up fairly lightly. Don't be tempted to put a lot of body English into it. If you do, all it does is distort things, and if you distort things, you'll find that they don't actually work well. You'll find that the helical will bind up and the focus will be stiffer than it should otherwise be. So I want to put on the front transfer shaft and its shield at this point. So I'll just stop here and then restart.